Good morning, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So in this video, we are going to talk about how the Trump tariffs are going to impact the Federal Reserve and their monetary policy strategies. It is a pretty common belief out there that the Trump tariffs are going to have an inflationary pressure within the economy. The idea that they are going to hit Mexico and Canada and some of these other nations out there with a pretty hefty tariff that is going to create an inflationary scenario here within the United States. And this is something that I believe a lot of corporations, a lot of people, investors, people are believing this and now taking an active approach to deal with the fact that we are going to be hit with these tariffs. So that is in itself going to have an inflationary pressure within the economy, and the Federal Reserve has to deal with the fact that the inflation is now running persistently above their 2% target. Now, this is what the common belief is out there, that the Federal Reserve is trying to get inflation down to a 2% target, and that once they have achieved this 2% target, they will then move their Fed funds rate into a neutral position. But until then, they want to remain restrictive. So if there is an inflationary pressure that is now put onto the economy due to the elevated inflation expectations from the possible credible threat of tariffs coming into the future, that will then put the Federal Reserve into an wait and see or even a possible raising of the interest rates in order to combat this inflationary expectation and the eventual inflationary scenario that we could be facing. So again, this is like the common narrative out there. Fed's going to keep interest rates elevated because we have persistently high inflation, with a tariff threat that is going to keep the inflation expectation elevated, which would then in turn keep the Federal Reserve from lowering the interest rates going into the future. Okay, so now that we have stated that, we're going to talk about what the Federal Reserve is really trying to do. Because this is the common narrative, what I just described. This is what you're going to find out there within the mainstream media. You're going to find that being discussed in just about every single YouTube channel out there. It's going to be something along that lines. Now, I'm going to tell you that is not the accurate way of looking at this. And the reason why it's not the accurate way of looking at it is because it doesn't take into consideration the neutral interest rate. This is the rate that is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. When the Federal Reserve is at neutral, that is the position of their sweet spot, so to speak, where they don't accommodate, they don't restrict, and inflation is running somewhere around their goal of 2% target. Right? So now this sweet spot of being in the neutral position is not something that can be studied or understood in real time. Now you can look at past and you can predict the future, but you cannot see the neutral interest rate in real time. To understand the neutral interest rate is to understand that there is expectation, that there is a form of understanding within the economy itself at a particular time that will raise or lower that neutral interest rate based on the expectations and the feelings of the market. So if they have a very depressed, not saying depressed like, hey, we feel bad, like a depression. If you have a lower inflation expectation, like the inflation expectation has been pushed down, and you have a very low inflation expectation, that will lower the neutral interest rate. If you have an elevated inflation expectation, that will raise the neutral interest rate. Because you have to think, if you have an inflation expectation that is running persistently high, you will demand more for your capital investments. So if you're going to put money towards something, you're going to say, hey, I need a higher return in order to combat the inflationary scenario that I am expecting coming into the future. And this in itself will then begin to raise the interest rates. Do you see how this works? So if the neutral interest rate is starting to move up on account of an inflation expectation that has been elevated, what that will do is it'll move ever closer to the Fed funds rate. So if the Federal Reserve is standing still, saying, hey, we're in a wait and see position, and then you have an inflation expectation that runs as persistently high like we have right now, considering the threats of tariffs, that in turn will raise the neutral interest rate and make the economy less restricted. Do you see what happened here? Because the Fed has an elevated Fed funds rate. That elevated Fed funds rate is supposed to be restrictive to the economy. The reason why it's restrictive to the economy is because it's well above the neutral interest rate. However, because we cannot see the neutral interest rate and we don't know exactly where it is, it could very well be rising right now based on the inflation expectations from the threat of tariffs. Nothing's happened yet. Remember, these tariffs haven't really even kicked in yet. The threat of it is there. It's a very credible threat. There's promises of it. There's many people who are now prepared and expecting it and dealing with the fact that they are going to have this tariff within their business, within the business model, within the idea of dealing with these tariffs. This is now persistent within the economy. And that in turn will then move the neutral interest rate ever higher. Nothing has taken place. Remember that. Right? The threat of it has, but the reality has not. What is in reality is the fact that people's expectation is now moving that neutral interest rate ever higher. If it moves higher, it becomes less restrictive of an economy. You see, like there is a way of creating a less restrictive economy simply by stating out there that there is going to be credible threats of tariffs, right? You scream that out loud enough, people's minds go, oh crap, what do we do about this? Better prepare. As they start to deal with the fact that they are going to have this inflation expectation coming to the future, that raises the neutral interest rate, makes the economy less restricted, and then people wonder why it is we have such a resilient economy. See, this is the reason this is why the Federal Reserve is really going to deal with the tariffs. They are using it to their advantage. If you want to create a less restrictive economy, just put the fear of tariffs out there, which would raise the inflation expectation, raising the neutral interest rate over time. And if the Federal Reserve stands still like they are, then the economy becomes less restricted, right? And then we have this resilient, robust economy with elevated interest rates. So now, if there was a time going into the future that there was an actual recession kicking in and we do have an actual weakening of the economy, when the Federal Reserve does lower rates, they will be able to drop far enough below the neutral rate to actually stimulate the economy. See, this is the problem that they were facing up until the inflation expectation started running so rampant within the economy, was that the fact that that neutral interest rate was so close to zero that trying to stimulate the economy with the lowering of interest rates, the Fed funds rate, trying to lower that to zero wasn't getting the Fed funds rate far enough below that neutral rate to stimulate the economy because they hit the lower bound of zero, the effective lower bound. This is what they refer to it as. So when people ask me, how's the Federal Reserve going to deal with the fact that the Trump tariffs are going to have this inflationary expectation and possible actual inflation hitting the economy, I'm thinking the Federal Reserve is totally benefiting from that. They can stand still, have the inflation expectation, not the reality, but the actual expectation of it, raise the neutral interest rate. They can sit back and say, hey, no, we got to stand still. Sorry, we might have inflation. We don't know if we can combat. No, we don't know. Right? They know. They know exactly what's going on. They're thinking, man, if we sit here, not say a word about what it is that we plan on doing going into the future, we're going to stand still, wait and see kind of pattern, hold steady, and let the Trump administration push an inflation expectation, let it run rampant through the economy. This will elevate that inflation expectation, which will in turn raise the neutral interest rate, which in turn is a benefit to the Federal Reserve itself. You see how they use the inflation against us? They used it to their own benefit. They didn't we learned from a long time ago that Jerome Powell knew that if they were going to save their monetary policy, that they would have to have an inflation expectation and an inflationary scenario within the economy, and they knew it was going to hurt households and businesses, especially the lower income people. However, he said it with himself that the alternative to that would be far worse. This is how the Federal Reserve is dealing with this. I've shown 1,000,000 times the credible threats. I've shown, I don't know how many through different videos, the articles that are misleading I've shown the speeches that are very clearly stated and how it is that the Federal Reserve is not going for a 2% target on their inflation. They're going for a 2% average inflation rate over time with no mathematical formula for figuring it out, and that the appropriate monetary policy is seeking to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. The reason why they're doing it is to raise the neutral interest rate. Nobody discuss it. I don't know how many people out there have talked about what it is that the Federal Reserve is going to do, being forced into all these statements, but never once ever include the real monetary policy strategy coming from the Fed, and that is to raise that neutral interest rate. And it's working. Every time we see an article, every time we hear the words tariff, every time we think of an inflation expectation that is now hitting us, that it's going to destroy the economy, destroy the dollar, destroy everything that we have and we believe in, that is a benefit to the Federal Reserve that works in the Fed's favor. They are looking for you to have that belief. They use it against you. And this is how. If you have the elevated inflation expectation, if you have that elevated inflation, then that is working to the Fed's benefit. It is raising the neutral interest rate, and they are getting their ammunition back. This is it. Anybody else who tries to explain it in any other way is looking at it through the symptoms of the problem. They look at it as a possible way of changing how it is that things are conducted so that it would line more up with what it is that they are doing, right? They want what is happening within the banking, within the political environment. They want those people to conduct themselves in a way that then aligns with how it is that they are conducting themselves. This is how you find most information being delivered to you. I'm one of the few people who says, forget all that. Look at it for what it is. Understand that it is not something that we are going to change, that it's not a problem, it's not correct, it's not wrong, it's just an is. We have to give it meaning that says what is it that we are going to do with this information so that we can better ourselves with it. That is the only meaning that we should be giving it. Everything else is superficial. Uneducated Economist. You guys let me know.